In this, the 41st lesson in the course, A Critical History of Economic Theory and Policy, we pick up with the last few years in Britain and then examine the economic policies adopted by the Canadians as they lived through the post-Second World War decades and the most recent global economic and financial crisis. In Lesson 35, we spent some time looking at the rise and fall of New Labour in Britain. By 2010, the British voters grew impatient for progress toward a full employment society. A general election held in May of 2010 resulted in the Conservative Party forming a coalition with the third-placed Liberal Democrats. Conservative leader David Cameron became Prime Minister. The new government then announced large-scale spending cuts aimed at reducing the nation's budget deficit. Labour's turn had run its course. Yet, as Anthony Giddens wrote in the New Statesman in 2010, here, Labour had to struggle with the disastrous legacy of the Thatcher years. Inequality had increased more steeply in the UK during those years than in any industrial country except for New Zealand, which had also followed Thatcher-style policies. The welfare system was run down, so investment in public services, coupled with reforms designed to make them more flexible and more responsive to the needs of their users, became a guiding principle. Labour was to be the party not of the big state, but of the intelligent state. Britain's new government called for austerity. Critics pointed to the financial problems of working people. In June of 2013, official unemployment was reported to be 7.8%. Nearly 1.5 million people remained without jobs. Some 460,000 people had been unemployed for 2 years or longer. As governments tend to do, those in power emphasize the positive. Those out of power emphasize the negative. The next great challenge to the British nation occurred in 2013 and David Cameron's proposal for a referendum on whether Britain should leave the European Union. In September of 2014, Scottish voters rejected the proposal to withdraw from the United Kingdom. And in the election of May 2015, the Conservative Party won a majority in the general election. Yet a year later, David Cameron is forced to resign after voters in a referendum opt to quit the European Union. Theresa May is elevated to become Prime Minister. When she calls for an early election in June of 2017, the Conservative Party loses its majority and a coalition government is formed again. In July of 2018, the government announced plans to establish a free trade area with the European Union. In response, Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson resigned. The residential property markets across the United Kingdom continued to experience rising prices, although the rate of increase had slowed. London and its surrounding region had the highest average prices at £479,000. Economists are forecasting actual declines in London property prices as more sellers are offering properties for sale than there is demand for. Any decline in property prices is positive for those who have been priced out of homeownership. During 2017, some 78,000 homeless families and individuals placed in temporary accommodation, a 60% increase since 2012. Around 5,000 people lived in tents or on the street, in doorways, parks, bus shelters, or wherever they can find shelter. An estimated 3.38 million people are sharing housing with relatives or friends. Elsewhere in the English-speaking corners of the globe, the governments of different countries were trying to follow a path that would get them reelected. Space does not permit a thorough examination of what occurred. However, the Canadian experience offers a number of lessons common to many other societies. Canada is a nation of people who control a huge territory, rich in natural resources, but challenged by severe winter weather and long distances between population centers. Moreover, with much of its production exported to the United States, the Canadian economy is closely linked to the health of the United States economy. As in the United States, political power in Canada has shifted over the decades. The Liberals came into power in 1968 under Pierre Trudeau. Conservatives regained power in 1979, but in December they lost a non-confidence vote on the budget and were forced to resign. Pierre Trudeau returned to office early in 1980, and the Liberals remained in power until September 1984, displaced by the Progressive Conservatives led by Martin Mulroney. An agreement to adopt free trade went into effect at the beginning of 1989. The following year, the Senate passed the unpopular Goods and Services Tax. For reasons that too few economists and political leaders seem to understand, the Canadian economy fell into recession. In 1993, Kim Campbell replaced Brian Mulroney as the head of the Progressive Conservatives, becoming Canada's first woman Prime Minister. In October, Liberal leader Jean Chrétien was elected in a landslide victory. The Progressive Conservatives, in power for 9 years, were reduced to a mere 2 seats, less than is required to be considered an official party. The Liberals remained in power until 2006, when defeated by the Conservatives led by Stephen Harper. By 1996, the provincial governments were forced to make huge spending cuts in order to balance their budgets. At the same time, more favorable taxation policies for families with 2 incomes and an increase in child care benefits helped bring thousands of Canadian women into the workforce. A 2013 working paper produced by the International Monetary Fund concluded that these policy changes had a very positive effect on the Canadian economy. The greater number of Canadian women in the workforce increased the amount of take-home pay many Canadian households enjoyed in the late 1990s, after the federal government relaxed taxation measures meant to deal with Canada's high deficit. Of particular importance was elimination of a 5% deficit reduction surtax for incomes up to $85,000. When the world financial system collapsed in 2007, triggering a global recession, Canada recovered faster than any of the other members of the G7 group of large developed countries. Its banks remained healthy, and low interest rates encouraged consumers to borrow and spend. Unfortunately, Canadian economists and other analysts were no better at recognizing the stress on the economy created by rising property prices in the nation's major population centers. Rising property prices resulted in a dramatic increase in the level of mortgage debt being carried by Canada's homeowners. Since the beginning of the recovery, household credit increased at twice the rate of personal disposable income. In the autumn of 2010, Canadian household debt climbed to an unprecedented level of 147% of disposable income. As of May 2018, this percentage had climbed to 170%. Only the Green Party in Ontario indicated an understanding of the powerful role of property markets in the economy and how tax policies drive the property markets. The party's 2006 platform states, The Green Party believes that taxation is a tool that should be used to achieve policy objectives. Resource use taxes and land value levies should be used to provide incentives to businesses and citizens to conserve energy and resources and to use land more efficiently. In March of 2011, Jean Boivin, former Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada, remarked on the favorable position in which Canada found itself following the global downturn. He said, "The Canadian economy was not spared. It still faces major difficulties and significant risks remain on the road ahead. Yet it is also true that the country's economic prospects have improved since the crisis, as we see in Montreal, which has enjoyed the strongest growth among Canadian urban centers." Yet Boivin is not gloating. He acknowledges that solutions to an even more severe global downturn must be found. Although Canada was not at the epicenter of the crisis, the contagion can spread through a number of transmission channels. The financial crisis was clearly leading to a massive slowdown of global economic activity with a direct impact on foreign trade. Since 3/4 of our exports are destined for markets in the United States, experience taught us that when the United States sneezes, Canada catches a cold. Sales of oil and gas, Canada's biggest single exports, are especially tied to the United States. Frantic lobbying by Canadian politicians of the Obama administration and the lead-up to a decision on whether to allow Keystone XL, a cross-border pipeline, is testament to this dependency. Meanwhile, Canadian energy exporters faced falling prices because of the boom in shale gas and oil in the American Midwest. The government's Economic Action Plan for 2013 included the same sort of initiatives as most other governments have adopted. Workforce training programs, providing incentives to manufacturing firms, and upgrading the nation's infrastructure are identified as key to future prosperity. In May of 2013, analysts at The Economist magazine warned that the property markets in Canada were poised for a crash, as potential buyers were withdrawing from the market in the face of unaffordable property prices. However, economists at the major banks forecast a soft landing. Analysts made only passing comment on the role of land constraints for the risk associated with the very high cost of residential property in high-growth communities across Canada. The real culprit, they said, was the relaxation of credit standards by the banks, including the ability to obtain 100% financing, raising fears of widespread defaults and foreclosures in the event of any significant increase in unemployment. The data for the Toronto region shows a modest, short-lived correction during 2017. The average sales price of detached housing in Vancouver, British Columbia had continued its upward climb, rising by the first quarter of 2018 in Vancouver East to $1.7 million and in Vancouver West to $3.5 million. As shown in this chart, Vancouver is particularly vulnerable. By 2011, land to total value ratios for many properties was already reaching 60%, meaning that value of the actual house purchase comprised less than 1/2 of the total property value. In 2011, economists at the Royal Bank of Canada warned that the monthly carrying costs, mortgage payments, property taxes, and utilities for a detached bungalow had climbed to over 70% of the average Vancouver household income. That is more than double the 32% threshold that Canadian banks use to gauge whether a borrower can handle a loan. Analysts in Canada estimate there are around 35,000 Canadians homeless on a given night. At least 235,000 Canadians experience homelessness in a year. Another 450,000 to 900,000 Canadians live temporarily with others, but without any guarantee of continued residency or immediate prospects for accessing permanent housing. One longtime observer of Canada's property markets who has written extensively on the effect of existing tax policy on these markets is Francis Peddle, a professor of philosophy and director of graduate studies at the Dominican University College, Ottawa, Canada. He is also director of research for the Canadian Research Committee on Taxation. In a paper he delivered in 1989, he made several important observations about the tax system. He stated, "I need not dwell here on the positive effects that would result from the implementation of site value taxation at the local level. Unfortunately, in Canada, there has been considerable movement away from the principle of taxing locational property values at the municipal level. Differentiated assessments are no longer done by provincially centralized assessment offices, and site value taxation is not given serious or in-depth attention by government bureaucracies or academic researchers." The Canadian Research Committee on Taxation is of the view that it is necessary to take a global approach to tax reform. By taxing site values at the municipal level, business enterprises on income expended in the production of wealth, and individual earnings at a proportional rate at the provincial and federal level, sufficient revenues will be generated to do away with consumption taxes and most other forms of counterproductive and arbitrary taxation of productive economic activity. We are advocating a single rate of taxation on individuals and companies in order to avoid the artificial structuring of business organizations. Despite the huge potential benefits of changing the way government raises its revenue at all levels in Canada, public support has proven difficult to generate in the face of powerful vested interests. This is made clear by Enid Slack in 2002. The ability to reform the property tax is more constrained than is the case for other taxes because of the visibility of the tax. It is particularly difficult to shift tax burdens onto residential property. Trying to change the way this tax is levied is politically difficult. At the very least, phase-ins and tax deferrals are an essential part of the tax policy design. More generally, the lesson is that no matter how economically desirable the long-run outcome of any policy change may be, its transitional effects may be sufficiently undesirable in political terms to kill it. From a public choice perspective, the losers from a change in policy tend to be very vocal, even if they are the minority, because they value their losses more than the gainers, even if they are the majority, value their gains. This problem is not unique to property taxes, but it is particularly significant in this case because of the visibility of this tax. Farmland prices in Canada have also been climbing, although at a declining rate. 22.1% in 2013, 14.2% in 2014, 10.1% in 2015, and around 8.5% in 2016. Canadian farmers acquiring additional acreage at these high prices have thus far been protected by the weak Canadian dollar's exchange value against the US dollar. Farmer debt is always an issue with potential for disaster if crop prices should drop. A 2017 report concluded, "The debt-to-asset ratio is below the long-term average, and working capital, which is the first line of defense, is plentiful." So the question remains, Has the search for solid ground in Canada been any more successful than in Britain, or in the United States, or other developed countries for that matter?